The responsibility for that today turns to our partner and friend Steve Sokol, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Pittsburgh World Affairs Council. Before coming to the Council, he spent a long time in Germany, was working there at the Aspen Institute, worked on programs for the American Council on Germany, was a program officer at the German Marshall Fund. He holds a doctorate in law and policy from Northwestern University and an MA in international relations and international economics from Johns Hopkins. Probably most important and certainly most lucrative is that he is the newly installed chair of our External Advisory Board, from which he could not escape, but for which we thank him. I will now turn over the moderation of the panel to Steve.
Thank you, Ron. And I didn't know that chairing the Center's advisory board came with a stipend. So this is always really good stuff to know. I'm delighted to be here today on October 3rd, German Unity Day, and delighted to be able to help facilitate this conversation, this discussion. As everybody who's participating knows, this fall marks the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall. Today, the 24th anniversary of German reunification. And I think for many of us, a great time for reflection about where Germany has been and where Germany is, and thinking about where Germany is going. In my case, I was lucky enough to be in Berlin from 1988 to 1990, so I got to know Berlin with the wall, was there when the wall came down, and got caught up in the euphoria the way that many people did. I went on to go back to school and ended up back in Germany in the early 90s. And in many ways, being in Germany and working there in the early 90s was more interesting because the euphoria surrounding the fall of the wall was gone, and people had to roll up their sleeves and make this thing called reunification happen. And so today, we have an opportunity to reflect on what happened and how that reunification process has worked. Today's conversation is being live streamed and is being recorded, so this is all on the record. Nobody can ever say afterwards that they said something off the record, because this will be saved for eternity. And we have a great panel together to help us sort of unpeel Germany today, unpack Germany today. Participating via video conference are Jackson Janes from the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, an organization he's been with since 1989, and he's in Washington, D.C. We also have Dr. Margaret Littler, Professor of Contemporary German Culture at the University of Manchester, participating from Manchester. We know it's in the evening there, Dr. Littler, so thank you for joining us this evening. And here in Pittsburgh, at the University of Pittsburgh, we have Dr. Georg Menz. He's a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Pittsburgh, and Ruprecht Polenz, a former member of the German Bundestag in the Christian Democratic Union, who also served as the chair of the Bundestag's Committee on Foreign Affairs. A terrific lineup. We could start in any number of different ways, but what I tried to do was sound out each of our speakers to get a sense of some of the things that they'd like to talk about. And I'm actually going to start by putting Georg Menz on the spot, even though I didn't tell you I was going to do this. He's, as I said, visiting professor of European politics on leave from his permanent post as professor of political economy at Goldsmiths College at the University of London, a prolific author. He's written Varieties of Capitalism and Europeanization, as well as The Political Economy of Managed Migration. And I wasn't necessarily thinking that he would frame a question that would be a great opening question, because I was looking at his biography more from a political economy and economics background. But here in Pittsburgh, we recently hosted Peter Schneider, the German author and social critic, if you will. And he prides himself in having coined the phrase Mauer im Kopf, or the psychological wall, the mental wall that existed after the fall of the physical wall. And as Georg and I were exchanging emails in preparation for today, the question came up, and this is the question I want to pose to you. Has Germany been truly reunited? Or is there still a wall, whether it's physical or mental?
Right. Well, thank you, Stephen. Well, I think in many ways the socioeconomic division between the two halves of the country shows no real sign of abating or indeed declining. So there are in many ways consistent differences and divergences that continue to effectively permit me to speak of an ongoing division in socioeconomic terms. If we consider a variety of macroeconomic data and data points, we effectively find that whether it's unemployment or GDP per capita or labour market participation rate, we find very, very different stories depending on whether we look at the Western or the Eastern lender. So there is very much a difference between the two halves of Germany, which sadly hasn't really been overcome. But that said, I think it is also worth mentioning that, of course, notwithstanding these differences, there are many, many admirable ways to try to overcome the hardship imposed on the de facto industrialization of most of the East, whether that's long-term commuting or whether that is effectively internal and international immigration from the East. I think in many ways there have been very, very striking and entrepreneurial ways of Easterners effectively coping with the economic hardship they have experienced. So in socioeconomic terms, sadly, the division lives on. With regards to other matters, however, I think in many ways one of the aspects of Germany that fascinates me quite a bit is the question to what extent the political culture has really become something quite distinct from the old Bond Republic. And I think in many ways, in terms of the political culture, there really isn't quite as much of a pronounced and stark difference between the two halves as was once true. In many ways, in more straightforward political cultural terms, with the obvious exception of the very pronounced position of the successor party to the Socialist Unity Party, the Die Linke, in many ways the political culture is no longer quite as distinct as perhaps was true 20 years ago, the immediate aftermath of unification.
So I'd like to ask a bit of a follow-up question to that, which is one of the things that I've been reflecting on because of the work that we do at the World Affairs Council in high schools. I suddenly feel very old because every time I'm in front of high school students talking about Berlin and reunification, I'm talking about something in their history books, not something that they've experienced. And so I've been thinking about the fact that people who were 25 years ago, when the wall came down, in their 30s now, in their 20s, they've grown up with a unified Germany. And there are some who would say that this generation of Einheitsdeutsche, or the youth of a unified Germany, have brought the country a lot closer to being much more unified. And I'd like to maybe ask for your comments or insights on the generational aspect as well as the socioeconomic aspect that you were just talking about.
Well, I look much younger than my age. I'm actually an old man myself. I was recently asked by one of my British students what I was referring to when I meant 1989. And I was mildly shocked, to be honest. But to get back to your question, I mean, I think there is I think certainly for the younger generation something akin to more of a pan-Germanic youth culture. And in that sense, again, I would probably say that if what you're suggesting is that effectively as time moves on, effectively the differences between the youth in the East and West are perhaps less stark. I would probably be inclined to agree. That probably is true. There are perhaps a few differences nevertheless, and the East always struck me as being on a social level perhaps slightly more structurally conservative, and that effectively comes to the fore in very, very different shapes and forms. So there are ongoing differences that cannot be wished away, but grosso modo, it's true that certainly for the younger generation, there is no longer to extremely different socialization experience of having effectively been grown up and socialized in the youth cadre and the youth organizations of the Communist Party versus effectively having grown up in a nominally democratic and nominally capitalist country in the West.
So I'm going to keep the conversation in Pittsburgh and shift to Ruprecht Polenz. He was trained as a lawyer but spent the last 20 years or so in politics. He was a member of the Bundestag from 1994 until the end of last year, 2013, and served as the chair of the Bundestag's Committee on Foreign Relations from 2005 to 2013. We're not yet going to go into foreign policy, although I hope that that ends up being one of the topics that we talk about today. But having had the opportunity to talk a little bit with Herr Polenz earlier today and hear some of his presentations, I think he might take a slightly different view to that of Dr. Menz that we just heard about the degree of unity between East and West. So I'd like to invite you to maybe make a few comments.
Thank you for inviting me to this conference, and hello to Jackson Janes in Washington. Good to see you via this video conference, because we are old friends and have met many times. My first remark is to judge what has been achieved with regard to unity, one has first to consider how deep the divide has been. And the divide, for instance, means that we were 45 years under different systems, communist-based system and Western democracy system in the West. And what is, in my view, even more important, the democratic experience in East Germany dated back to 1933. The end of Weimar Republic was the end of democratic experience until '89. And this has to be taken into account if you judge what had happened afterwards. And my second point is, if you try to judge what kind of, what is left, what have you achieved, you must be clear with yourself. What is your measurement of homogeneity of a society? How homogeneous do you think should Germany look like if you would address you have overcome a divide? And I should remember that, for instance, even in West Germany, we have a difference in income between Ostfriesland and Hamburg from 1/3. In Hamburg, the average income is 1/3 higher than in the West Ostfriesland. And we have high unemployment area regions in the Ruhrgebiet and elsewhere. And my question would be, really honest, if you came from the space and you would get all the data you are now looking at to get out, is there still a divide between East and West? Would you put it in this basket, or would you put all the data in different types of fragmentation of German society?
Do you care to respond, or do you at all?
What was the question put on?
I mean, it wasn't necessarily a direct question.
No, it's just because the German society is a hybrid society, is a society with many diversifications. We have always had in German history a more richer south and a more poorer north, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I think this question, are you now really a united country, and looking at the old Iron Curtain divide, is to some extent a bit misleading, because we have now other divisions in our country than this one. I think this one is really overcome.
So we have two different opinions, a little bit, looking at different factors, and this also provides a good opportunity to turn to Margaret Littler and bring her into the conversation. As I mentioned, she's a professor of contemporary German culture at the University of Manchester. She's been at the University of Manchester since 1990, serves on the editorial board of the leading UK journal on German studies entitled German Life and Letters. And she, among other things, has studied ethnic minorities in Germany. And so I think talking a little bit about the multicultural society in Germany as a new area, possibly of division, but also possibly a sign of what a new Germany looks like when one thinks about Germany today. So, Dr. Littler, turning to you, can you talk a little bit about the changing perception, but also position of ethnic minorities in Germany over the last 25 years since reunification?
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much for your invitation. Yes, I would like to come at this perhaps from a slightly different angle, not from a sort of an ethnographic or anthropological perspective, but looking rather at what writers, intellectuals from the particularly Turkish German ethnic minority, if you like, how they present the experience of 1989 and 1990 and thereafter. And I'm thinking particularly of an interview with Zafer Şenocak, the writer and intellectual, who described described shortly after unification how a sector of the population of the Federal Republic, which was well on its way to integration, suddenly found itself alienated and rather excluded from debates about German identity after unification. Those who had been working in the Federal Republic for a good 3 decades by then, or who'd grown up there, suddenly found themselves ethnicized, found themselves designated foreign in this new unified Germany. And reflecting on what's happened since then in the last 25 years, I think it's really interesting how that ground has shifted again, and indeed how Germany has become, perhaps in spite of itself, a really multicultural society. It's interesting how even sympathetic academics to minority culture in Germany perhaps perpetuated the situation of ethnicization, foreignizing the minority writers by viewing them through the lens of intercultural German studies, intercultural dialogue, putting on them the burden of representation of other cultures and of themselves, indeed, as ethnic others. And I think over the past 10, 15 years, there's been a shift in the discourse relating to minority culture, to, for example, Turkish German writers and filmmakers, and away from this notion of the intercultural and towards viewing them simply as part of what is now German culture.
Dr. Littler, can you talk a little bit too about the acceptance of the foreign population, if you will, in Germany? You've talked a little bit about how they might be perceived, but how do you feel that they've been accepted in German culture and society?
As I said, I'm not an anthropologist. I can't really talk about how the population as a whole. But if I can perhaps say a bit about how Turkish German writers, filmmakers have become substantially more mainstream, I would say. Both in thinking of filmmakers, like the obvious example is Fatih Akin, who is now a very famous, very successful filmmaker in Germany. But I'm also interested in the avant-garde filmmakers, filmmakers in the Berlin School, such as Thomas Arndt, working alongside Christian Petzold. They are simply making films about the new Germany, not about ethnic minorities in it.
Ron Linden has a follow-up question.
I'd like to address this to you, Dr. Littler, or others in the panel who might want to address it. There's another group of people who came back, in this case, to Germany after 1989, and I'm interested in what their experience has been. That is, Germans who, one way or another, found themselves living elsewhere, the Soviet Union in particular, and were able, after 89, especially after 91, to come back to Germany. We don't hear much about them. My question would be, have they had an easier time? Where would they fit in the hierarchy of groups as compared to the Aussies, the Turks, or did their assimilation, was it seamless?
I'm sure it wasn't seamless. I'm sure that that would be a gross oversimplification. But on the other hand, for those who can claim ethnic German ancestry, clearly they are seen as being in a very different category from those who are maybe the children of labour migrants from the 1960s, yeah. So I think I wouldn't say that their integration is necessarily easier, but I think the way they are viewed is substantially different.
Yeah, there's and you're quite right, Ron. There's actually very little academic work on that. There is a young woman up at Birmingham at Aston University by the name of Kristen Hess, who's done a little bit of ethnographic research on the Russlanddeutsche, which are the ethnic Germans who came back from the actually not just Russia, but the entirety of the Soviet Union from the 1990s onwards. And from what I can tell, I mean, effectively, it is somewhat of a tale of two cities, in that the integration in labour market terms, again, perhaps betraying my own background here, has been somewhat of a mixed picture, and there are numerous difficulties there to do with degree recognition. And recognition of vocational training, and quite frankly, also the standards of vocational training are quite different. So there were quite a few difficulties there in terms of effectively finding one's feet in the new united Germany, just in terms of making the transition from what was a very, very different labour market with a very, very different kind of skill set as an set of expectations. On a more cultural level, I think one factor that often gets neglected is that many of the ethnic Germans actually were married to Russians. So a lot of their partners, a lot of their children were effectively ethnic Russians, which I think impeded the integration to a certain extent and didn't perhaps make it quite as smooth as would have been otherwise the case. Language skills and obviously also come into play. That said, I mean, it seems to me the integration in cultural terms has been fairly successful, but the labour market problems, I think, are there and are real.
So I'd like to bring Jack Janes into the conversation and perhaps widen the aperture a little bit. Jack is the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He's been engaged in German and German-American affairs for decades. He's taught at the universities of Freiburg, Gießen, and Tübingen. He served as the director of the European Office of the German Marshall Fund in the early 1980s when it was located in Bonn. And he even has a connection here to the University of Pittsburgh, where he served as the director of program development at EUCE. So, Jack, it's great to have you as part of this discussion, particularly because of your connection to EUCE. In a recent article that you wrote, titled October 3rd in the AICGS Advisor, you talked a little bit about the shift of tectonic plates that took place in 1989. And it wasn't just in Germany that this change took place. You draw on the fact that Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, of course the Soviet Union, all underwent change. Can you maybe provide a little bit of a historical perspective on the geopolitical shift that we've seen over the course of the last 25 years as the Cold War has come to an end and something new has emerged?
Well, that's a tall order, Steve, but in the end, what I wanted to do was to simply say that 1989 was a year in which things seemed to combine that had building up probably for a very long time. My sense is that when you look at the 3rd of October, you need to look at the 9th of October. You need to look at what happened in Poland in the earlier part of that year. There's a chain reaction going on around Europe and into the Soviet Union at that time And I don't think it's an accident. But the questions that I raised in that article, to some extent, are with those tectonic plates shifting, Europe losing the borders that had been had for 40 years, and seeing how Europe was on its way to becoming whole and free, as President George Herbert Walker Bush wanted it to be when he gave his speech in '89. That was something that very few people could have expected in maybe even 2 or 3 years before then. I remember very well, and Ruprecht, you'll remember this, when the head of the then GDR, Erich Honecker, came over and was welcomed in Bonn in 1987 at a state visit. Last night, Ruprecht, I was with Richard Schröder, who you remember, the theologian. And we were talking about what that meant to many people on either side of the wall. Was that a recognition of the permanence of German unification? And obviously it wasn't. And I think that one of the things that geopolitically or tectonic plate-wise, we have to really kind of keep in mind here is two things. One of it is never, ever take anything for granted in history. Never believe that things are in permanent position. And the second thing, and that's the way I ended that article, is that who would want Germany to be other than what it is today? Despite the various difficulties, despite the divisions, despite the various different adjustments that have been made in Germany and throughout Europe, who would want Germany to be not unified today? And who would want Germany not to be playing the role it's playing today? I don't know that I would know anyone who would pipe up and say, I wish it hadn't happened. So I think that geopolitically, we're still learning lessons of 1989. I'm reminded of Kissinger's conversation with the then head of China, who said, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to tell. Well, I think we're still working through what it is that Germany has evolved into 25 years later. But the bottom line is, I think we'd all rather be where we are rather than where we were.
Maybe as a follow-up question to you, Jack, and have Polenz please weigh in as well, because this is your area of expertise. 25 years ago, as the wall was coming down, who would have thought that Germany might have taken as active a role as it did in the late 90s in Kosovo, or in 2001 in Afghanistan, or right now we're seeing that Germany is playing a role in trying to ease some of the tensions around the Ukraine crisis in its interaction with Russia. And as I think everybody knows from the media, the country's top politicians recently approved the delivery of weapons to Kurdish forces battling Islamic militants in Iraq. That's not something that people might have anticipated in '89 or the early 90s. So Germany's come a long way, and in a sense the world has come a long way. Jack, to try to turn it into a question, as you look back over the last 25 years and Germany's evolving role on the world stage, in light of the fact that you believe that this is where we want Germany to be and where many Germans want Germany to be, what are sort of the next steps for Germany? How does Germany take on the kind of responsibility that's commensurate with its economic weight and economic power?
Well, I think that's something that Ruprecht could probably address better than I, but let me just add a few comments. I mean, I think that if you'll all recall that speech that I just referenced that President Bush gave in 1989 in May, before the wall came down, was a call for Germany to be a partner in leadership. I think Germany has become a leader in partnership. And I think that process of becoming a leader in partnership within Europe and to some extent across the Atlantic has not been without any hiccups. It certainly hasn't been without any hiccups in Germany itself. Ruprecht and I might have been sitting near each other in February at the Munich Security Conference when three leading figures in Germany, the president of Germany, The foreign minister of Germany and the defense minister of Germany got up in the stage in the Munich Security Conference and said, Germany has to step up in its leadership. And of course, everybody said, that's great. I wonder what that means. And I think that to some extent, this is where we are at a point where Germany as a leader in partnership is learning how to exercise that responsibility, but also that power. Not easy for Germany. It always was conscious of a statement that you might remember from Fritz Stern, who once said, when Germany thinks of its past, others think of its future. I don't think that there is that kind of a concern in 2014 in most places. I think we heard that from the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, a couple of years ago. So in the end, I think that we're looking at a Germany trying to find out what its role is as a leader in partnership and always conscious of what has been. But I think it's not quite easy to say what is next, Steve. There are obviously challenges all over the place that Germany is facing, but it's inevitable that a lot of the arrows of those solutions to those problems point to Berlin.
I remember some of the concerns we faced in, let's say, late 89, 1990 from our allies. I remember that François Mitterrand made a trip to Moscow in December 89 to ask, do you really give the Germans reunification, Mr. Gorbachev? And if you look at the memoirs of Maggie Thatcher, in these days premier in Britain, until she wrote her memoirs, says, I was against reunification. And in Europe, it was only Spain who was supportive. Felipe González, the socialist premier, and therefore there is a close personal friendship between our Christian Democratic Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Felipe González in these days, and the United States, who did not waver and said, we have always said, if we can achieve this, Germany will get it. And on the other side, Gorbachev, who agreed in giving in. And we had these difficult negotiations, 2+4, and we had to solve our border, not dispute, but we had to settle the border with Poland. And this happened. And why were these concerns? And I can understand them, because there were considerations. Will Germany really stay as part of the West, remain integrated in Europe? Or will Germany start again getting on its own, more independent, more national, and looking for a new Sonderweg? You know this famous word to describe German politics from the late 1900s until the end of the Second World War. And for instance, our common currency is a result of these concerns, because usually you should have had a political union first and then your common currency. But the French insisted in having a common currency with us before we got reunification. So these were the concerns in the time before we could celebrate on the 3rd of October 1990 our reunification, and until now this is our national holiday. What did we do afterwards? I think we proved that the assurances Helmut Kohl and others gave became true. We were the advocates for the Poles, for the Hungarians, for the Czechs to join European institutions like European Union, like NATO. We were advocating, lobbying for them, and we were finally successful. And I can tell you, when I resigned after nearly 20 years in foreign policy, I considered, did I really see any kind of success in foreign policy all over the globe? If I look to the Middle East, no. If I'm looking to Ukrainian crisis, no. If I'm looking to what's going on in Russia, probably not. But there is really a true success story, and this is the overcome of the European divide and getting the transformation of the Middle and Eastern European countries into multi-party, rule of law abiding market economic democracies. This is a true success story. And Germany contributed to this, and so we are still engaged with this process when it comes to the Balkans. And we had this huge crisis after the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 90s, and NATO intervened, and until now we are with American troops, German troops in Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it is necessary because otherwise we might see again violence between Serbs and Kosovo Albanians, for instance. And Germany is still, regardless of all the internal problems of the European Union, siding with what we promised in the so-called Stability Pact for the Balkans, where the European Union promised that all the states of the former Yugoslavia could join the European Union if they fulfill the criteria, if they get to better footing with each other. And we are on a good track with regard, in this regard. And we took responsibility also when it came to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban regime. And we were in Kabul and we were in the northern part of Afghanistan until now. We have our troops helping fighting piracy on the Horn of Africa and securing the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon in this UNIFIL mission, which provides foreign help to get this ceasefire kept. And in many, many other international conflicts, my country tries to be helpful in settling that. Crisis prevention via our foreign aid and development programs are also to be mentioned. But at the moment, for instance, we are doing our best together with the P5 to get to a solution in the crisis with nuclear weapons in Iran. So this is the role we are now playing. We remain part of the West. We are part of the West. We are not neutral. We are nothing in between. We are trying not only to be consumers of international security, which provide others, as we have been with limited sovereignty until 1990. We are now trying to be contributors to international security, peace and stability, and I think we are not doing too badly.
So I know that Dr. Littler and a few others need to drop off in about 15 minutes, and so I thought we could maybe open it up to questions and comments from others who are here as well. There's a lot on the table in terms of German domestic policy, in terms of foreign policy. Does anybody here at EUCE want to ask a first question to break the ice? Or is there a signal?
Do I count?
You already asked to count as a question, but go ahead.
No. If there's someone else here,
I'm teasing you. Yeah, no.
Over there.
Great. Last year I spent a decent amount of time researching the Oder-Neisse line, so the territorial status quo that existed both during the Cold War and then the one that they tried to establish, I guess, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. How important do you believe, and this is for anybody, I suppose, how important do you believe that establishing a territorial status quo was in allowing, or I guess the major powers allowing Germany to reunify?
I think in the Helsinki Treaty 1975, the Soviet Union, United States, and the participants in the so-called Helsinki process signed a treaty where territorial sovereignty, integrity was guaranteed in a mutual way, and I think this was quite important. And to jump into the present, this has been violated by the annexation of Crimea from the Russian side right now. So Russia broke this treaty and other treaties as well, and this is why the crisis in Ukraine is so serious.
Does anybody else?
I mean, I would take a slightly different view from that. I think the question is a good one, and the borders of Germany were, of course, provisional, and the war had not ended. There was no peace treaty after 1945. The parts of Germany that were, to use the official term, provisionally under Polish administration were effectively given away without much in return. Now you might say this was strategically wise, But the fact remains, effectively, not much was effectively achieved as a kind of quid pro quo. I think ultimately you have to look at domestic German politics to accord for that, and the individuals that were effectively forced to flee from those parts, Silesia and Pomerania, effectively, I don't think by the late 1980s were quite as influential amongst the parties of the centre right, that is to say amongst the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union in Bavaria, as once they were. I think they had been sidelined quite considerably. This is in part also a generational question, that is to say, I think the generation that was born in Western Germany no longer felt quite as strongly as perhaps the generation that had itself undergone effectively forced flight from those parts that had experienced the brutality in many ways, effectively the revenge inflicted on many Germans that were effectively handed out to them. So to answer your question, I mean, I think essentially there wasn't really much of a lobby that would have spoken up on behalf of individuals who would have felt particularly strongly about having those parts of the country reunited into effectively a larger Germany. But I will say also, I mean, if you think through the foreign policy dimensions, it would have obviously ruffled feathers quite considerably with the Poles. It would have ruffled feathers with the Soviet Union. It would have been very, very difficult to negotiate. So in fairness to Genscher and Kohl, it would have been a very, very tall order indeed. But they didn't go down that road.
Do either of the other two want to weigh in on that at all? Jack or Dr. Littler, anything? Dr. Littler, I have maybe a follow-up question for you, given that you need to drop off soon, and that has to do with gender in Germany over the last 25 years, and whether there's been a noticeable change in the role that women have played in German society.
Right. Again, I can't really speak about German society as a whole, but I'm just thinking about recent essay collections, recent books published within German studies. It's become evident that when recently a collection was mooted, was proposed with a chapter on women's writing in the Berlin Republic, it was met with some skepticism because frankly that just no longer seems to be a meaningful or necessary topic to pursue. So I think in some ways, certainly the position of women artists and writers can very much more be taken for granted these days than maybe even 10, 20 years ago. I think that's
okay.
My main comment.
Thank you. Other questions, comments from any of those who are participating, either from the video conference sites or here at EUCE? Does anybody in Florida want to ask a question? Anybody there?
Yeah, I think I have a question.
So Florida, go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Good. Perfect. So my question is, with the commemoration of World War I and it's 100 years after, how do you think also the events that happened in Germany 25 years ago, how do you think those two important dates merge this year, and how can we compare them, and how can we make not a prediction, but how can we see through the future of those two events, and what do you think is the importance or the impact of both of them in the next 50, 100 years regarding European politics and the international politics as well.
So if I got the question, it's sort of reflecting on the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I and where we were 100 years ago in 1914, but also looking at what happened 25 years ago and German reunification. I think, interestingly, one thing that we haven't really talked about that much, although you touched on it briefly, is Russia, the Ukraine crisis, Crimea. Are we sitting on top of, are we observing a potential tinderbox that maybe is somewhat similar to the one of 100 years ago, or are the circumstances very, very different?
I think they are different. If you look back at the outbreak of the First World War, for me the most gripping observation is how a regional conflict on the Balkans turned within a fortnight to become a world war, and not the third war on the Balkans, which would have been the most plausible outcome usually. We had seen a war on the Balkans in a year before and 3 years before, but this time it was different due to these mechanisms of the alliance system in Europe, and as Christopher Clark describes wonderful in his book, I really can recommend, Sleepwalkers, that the effects were not foreseen in a way they should have been foreseen, and it has been possible to foresee them. I think if you look now to the Ukrainian crisis or to the Syrian crisis, there might also be a certain danger that these regional conflicts might spread and turn even a greater area into conflict, especially what we are seeing now in the Middle East. But I do think that first we have a different situation in Europe due to this process of unifying the whole continent, including the Middle and Eastern European countries. This is a totally different situation. And I also think that the presence of nuclear weapons still provides some kind of reassurance that we will avoid this nightmare of a total confrontation in the world. So the mechanism which preserved peace during the Cold War is still, to some extent, working. For instance, we don't want, and we will not intervene militarily in Ukraine right now because nobody wants to get in a direct confrontation with Russia militarily, due to the simple fact that this is a nuclear-armed country. And on the other hand, we made very clear that the eastern border of NATO is also militarily drawn red line. If Russia would try to do similar things, what they have done on Crimea, to Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, where we also have some significant ethnic minorities of Russian origin, this would be seen very different, and therefore I think Putin will get the message. So we are better able to contain these conflicts. But, and here I'm with Jack, in politics nothing is settled. You have always to work on that, and it is not a self-evident thing. When I gave a speech on these issues, the Europeans think that peace is granted, and that the saying of Immanuel Kant, peace is never granted, you have to secure it, is put out of order, at least in Europe. This is true due to our structures which preserve peace, even if we might have some kind of bad politicians. But if we fail with our peace-serving structures, we are back to square one again. And therefore, keeping the European Union on a track to get more and more to a closer union is so important. And the biggest challenge for us in Europe, for instance, in my view, will be if Britain in 2 years from now has its referendum to leave the Union or to stay. And hopefully our American friends help us to convince the Brits to stay.
Could I bring us, I'd like to stay with the topic of the past, but bring us back to Germany and also make everybody in the room uncomfortable, which I'm very good at. This is October 3rd and celebrated as German Unity Day, but everybody in the room probably knows, of course, that the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th. Not a day in German history that Germans would prefer to remember. So, of course, Unity Day was celebrated on October 3rd, not on November 9th. And especially in light of what you said before, George, about different past and different people who've grown up in the East versus the West. I used to say about Russia as it goes forward, the question was, does Russia have a usable past? Does it have a past that it can draw on to help it build a robust democratic society? My question with regard to Germany is, especially as we see and document the rise of anti-Semitism, anti-immigration sentiment, not just in Germany but elsewhere in Europe, what past will Germany draw on in the next few years, knowing that the generations come from a different experience? Even people 25 years will not have known that past.
So maybe that's a question for each of the panelists.
Yeah, that's right. For each
Does
Littler has to leave first, right?
yes.
Okay.
Speak up.
Yeah, there's a lot there in your question.
Yes, there is.
A lot there. I wonder if I can do justice to all of it. I mean, I do think the political culture today differs quite dramatically from that of the early 1990s, in that you are currently experiencing a mass movement of asylum seekers into Germany. 500,000 annual applications is on par with what it was right after the fall of unification. And yet, there is, I don't think, any sign of the sort of violent backlash that you witnessed back then. And it seems to me that there is a very, very different political culture now prevalent in the country. And that has good and bad sides. The good side of it is that effectively the country has become a lot more tolerant and accepting of ethnic difference. The bad side of it is that you have now, in a very, very Germanic fashion, no longer any room for dissent for people who disagree with mass immigration. And that, I think, is quite worrying. That troubles me quite considerably. That essentially, those who effectively disagree with mass immigration are immediately effectively equated with holding pro-Nazi sympathies. That is a slightly more disturbing aspect of it. But I'm not sure if the country effectively hasn't moved on fundamentally. In my view, it really has. And I think the attitude towards immigration and indeed also towards its Jewish minority, I think, has evolved quite considerably from 20 years, from 40 years, from 50 years ago. Again, the slightly troubling aspect of anti-Semitism in Germany today is that a lot of it is driven by Muslim immigrants. If you look at the people who partake in these demonstrations, if you look at the violence that is carried out against Jewish institutions in Germany, it tends to be carried out by young Muslim immigrants who are not terribly well integrated and who are essentially importing their antagonism towards Jews into Germany, which is not a very pleasant or pretty sight. What past does Germany have that it can connect to? I mean, that's the million Deutschmark question. One would like to think effectively that there is enough there that predates the era of Nazi barbarism to which it can connect to. But I disagree a little bit with my colleague here on the panel. That is, I think, sadly, some of the foreign policy moves that have been taken in the 1990s and since effectively have been partially justified by the darker era in German history. That is to say, Joschka Fischer infamously, of course, effectively posited that Auschwitz is effectively an obligation to stop Srebrenica. I think that is the worst kind of instrumentalization of history you can think of. Effectively, what was once the taboo of partaking in global military adventure has now turned around into a kind of self-imposed obligation to partake in overseas military expenditures, which have absolutely no purpose, and certainly don't serve any kind of German national interest. German troops should not be in Mali today, and they really shouldn't be there. That's not in any shape or form related to any kind of sensible German interest. And similarly, I think we have to be very careful with regards to where the European Union is taking us, and it is taking us into directions which, in some instances, can be highly problematic. I don't think it is in the German interest to confront Russia. I don't think there would be a confrontation between Germany and Russia if it hadn't been for the ham-fisted attempt to meddle with Ukrainian politics. We would be in a very different place today if that hadn't happened. So I think Germany needs to effectively roll back in some instances and find its own voice and discover that its own voice does not necessarily dovetail with that of the European Union.
So, Gregor, I saw your hand go up. Do you have just a short intervention?
Yeah, short intervention. I think when it's a very different way how you define German interest. Stability in Europe and Africa is also a German interest, and especially if you cannot on the one hand say, well, it's problematic, there's no party that actually prevents mass immigration, but at the same time saying it's not our interest actually to stabilize other regions in the world. So there's a direct link between mass immigration and intervention, also in the sense. So these things cannot be detached.
So this could almost be a whole other subject for one of the conversations on Europe, because it gets into some of these real complexities. But I don't want to lose touch with Ron's question about history. And so, Dr. Littler, to come to you for a closing comment before you have to go, does Germany have a usable past? And what will Germany draw on through your lens of how to look at Germany?
Yes. First of all, I've thought quite a lot about the idea of cultural memory as identity forming, and what implications that has for those who don't share the cultural memory, who don't share the German past, and I find it particularly interesting how minority intellectuals have intervened in debates about Holocaust memory, for example, with the urgent lesson to be learnt from that about racism in the present. But on the other hand, there are perhaps pasts that need to be unearthed, that need to be made available, which don't tend to be a part of the contemporary debate about German cultural memory. Just thinking back to the Ottoman Empire and Germany, the First World War again. There are other histories, other histories of connection between these countries, which perhaps it would be salutary now to recall and to commemorate and to learn from also.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Jack, let's come to you with this question as well. I mean, your article sort of looks at history. I know that through your long engagement with Germany, I think Ron's touched on a great question here. From your perspective, does Germany have a usable past, and what sorts of things does it draw on today?
Well, I think it basically comes out of World War II and decides to restart itself with a commitment that, never again and never alone. That was the mantra. And I think that that's the reason that the Federal Republic of Germany, during those years of division, was so committed to keeping the European movement moving and paying for it, by the way, straight through till the present. The never alone and never again, I think, was always verified by what it then did. And we talked a little bit about Yugoslavia, Germany going into its first conflict to stop genocide in the 90s. And by the way, I thought that was a good idea. There, Germany did find its voice. And it seems to me that the question today is, how does Europe find its voice? And my sense is that if Europe's going to be in any way, shape, or form the project that it is, and it's a process that's still unrolling, then it still has to find an answer to the question, where do we go as a European Union? Now, if my colleague here on the panel is suggesting that Germany should distance itself from that, or that it should, however, find a voice separate from that, then I would disagree vigorously. But my point is that Germany's past of the last 4 or 5 decades has shown that the mantra that is there, never again, never alone, and I think to some extent that has been the way that it has guided its European policy. How that will proceed depends not just on Germany. It depends on 27 other countries. And I think that Germany is playing a role here to say that we can build something that is better than what we had 50, 60 years ago. But its own, if you have one day to walk through Berlin and talk about the past, you can see it visibly in front of you almost every other block. I don't think there's any other city in Europe like that. And it seems to me that that gets back to the issue of having Germany never forgetting its past, but remembering another mantra, which we use around here at AICGS, which is remember, but renew. And that is what Germany, I think, has done over these last 50, 60 years.
Ruprecht Polenz has been sitting here nodding through much of what you just had to say. So let me ask.
Do you have a usable past? There is no cherry picking in history, and we should not try to do what Putin is doing right now for Russia. What is Putin doing? He is drawing imperial historical lines from Catherine the Great until him, describing Russia as Russian history as more or less unbroken, straightforward, to the bright horizon of the future. And he can do this because Russia never, ever has tried to have a discussion on the dark sides of the Soviet Union in general and on Stalin in particular. Memorial, who tried to achieve this kind of discussion, is under tremendous pressure, and due to the new non-governmental legislature, even more so. You have to make use of your past, regardless, was it a bright spot or a dark spot? And of course, you can easily be proud of the bright spots, and Jackson James mentioned what we can be proud of after the Second World War, for instance, and there are of course also areas in German history where we can easily be proud of. And when it comes to the dark spots and to the very dark spots, the question is, what did we learn and how did we learn? And then it comes to what we are discussing right now. And therefore, I think we can also, to a certain extent, be proud of what we learned. We cannot be proud of our dark sides in history, no means. But we can be proud of what we did learn. And therefore, this is how one should include history in political narratives in a democracy. We should not try to exclude. For instance, another interesting example. We are now observing what's going on in Hong Kong. And the Chinese tried to deal with the Tiananmen massacre in a way that they don't allow any speech, any research, any public broadcasting, nothing, because they think if there is no talk about, nothing, it just didn't happen, you know. And of course, this is not true. And therefore, maybe other societies have to talk what they have done with the ingenious people before they came to the country. And so there are different dark spots in different countries' history. But nevertheless, you can make use of history, being proud of your country, but mainly how you learn from the dark sides in history. And of course, it's much easier to admire Beethoven and Mozart, of course.
Thank you. Any questions from the EUCE Annex? No? Okay. Any questions here from any of the people in the room or comments?
If you don't mind, I would like to go back to the beginning of the panel when we discussed political unity, political culture, because my experience has been quite different from what has been described here, and I'm somewhat, not necessarily surprised, but I think that growing up in West Germany, you do not necessarily have to reflect on East Germany, but it doesn't work the other way around. I spent some time living in East Germany and also coaching basketball at the time to a group that was a couple years younger than me, and they've all been born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And for them, it was extremely important to think of what West Germany actually means, because so many of their family members, so many of their older friends were actually moving to West Germany. You don't have the same mechanisms in the West, and I do think we need to consider that more carefully if we want to understand why also we have so little political participation in East Germany. So, like, if you or Professor Menz would like to comment on that, like, how do we account for the differences in political participation between East and West today?
First, I would say, if it comes to political parties, it is interesting that the former SED, then PDS, now Die Linke, has in Eastern Germany as many party members as all the other parties together, still due to the old days. And therefore, it is, for instance, quite difficult for Social Democrats in Saxonia, with 4,000 party members, to be as present in every village as they are in the West. And this is for historical reasons, because democratic parties were not allowed to work in GDR times. And this, and of course, after the wall came down, it was not so, people were not so eager to join a party because they wanted to distance themselves from all kinds of politics. I think this is a reasonable approach. They have to take care from other things. Second point, civil society structures. We have a broad system of NGOs from any kind of source in the West, but it takes time to get to similar associations and so on in the East, because before everything was only with permission of the Communist Party and under their rule, and this fell to some extent apart, but nothing new did grow so fast. And what also might be some explanation is that immediately after the wall came down, people had to care for themselves. They lost their jobs. And if you are looking for a new job, you probably will not spend much time in engaging in social society work and things like that. So these might be some explanations. I don't know if this is sufficient, but this comes to my mind when you describe this. I had contacts from Münster to Jena to Erfurt to Neubrandenburg. I have been in 3 parts of Eastern Germany immediately after the wall came down. I tried to help to build up self-governing structures in the economics field with chambers of commerce in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And even this was not so easy because there were no private companies left, you know. And all this has to be rebuilt, reconstructed, and this took time. If you look now at the outcome, how many people are going to vote, yes, it's true, we have a very small outcome, and this is, in my view, not really, I have no explanation for that, because especially the people in Eastern Germany should know how important free elections are. And what I'm telling them, and also if we have a small turnout of elections in Germany, even if it compared with the United States is still reasonable, yeah, you should mention this also. I tell them, look, there are parts in the world where people are risking their life to fight for free elections. Look what's now going on in Hong Kong. And you are not interested in walking just on Sunday to the voting booth and make your sign. I cannot understand this.
I mean, look, as I said before, I'm an old man, and I think appearances are somewhat deceiving, perhaps. I don't have first-hand experience as you do dealing with East German youth. I'm an academic. I also have to admit I haven't perhaps done that particular part of my homework, and that I'm not aware of significant differences in terms of voter turnout and political participation from the East and the West. It does seem to me that there might be a slight difference there in terms of the way in which civil society is defined, and in terms of the political activities that youth engage in. But I think you also have to bear in mind that we now have a president and a chancellor who grew up in the former east of Germany. They both also have some Stasi contacts. But they nevertheless are effectively, in many ways, a sea change from the political culture of the 1980s and of the old West Germany. This is, for better or worse, a different Germany, and it is there are people who are socialized very differently. Angela Merkel was, of course, in her youth, not just a fluent Russian speaker, but she was also someone who gained distinction as a youth leader for propaganda in the communist youth movement. So she was an ardent communist, and then switched, of course, her allegiance over to the center-right. But she is a new kind of animal and a new kind of leader for a united Germany. So the country as a whole, I think has changed. But what you're getting there with regards to people effectively abstaining and staying home and effectively not being active in political parties, again, I would need to look at data to give you a proper, robust and sound and scientifically decent response to that. But my hunch is that you get a pan-Germanic decline in voter turnout that really is in some sense part of a bigger malaise. There's a fantastic German word, of course, for that, which is Politikverdrossenheit, which is making its way across the North Sea into parts of England where effectively voter turnout is similarly abysmal. There is no one to vote for. The Social Democratic Party essentially has implemented the most far-reaching cuts to the German welfare state that wherever possible to imagine and to engineer. This is a party which effectively has betrayed the Social Democratic roots. On the right, we have a formerly Christian Democratic Party, which is voting in favor of homosexual marriage, which is giving away effectively German passports, which is effectively watering down the German citizenship laws. And it is a party which is effectively moving so far to the center that it is betraying its conservative roots. So if you have the two mainstream parties essentially adrift without really any kind of clear orientation as to what they stand for, who is there to vote for? I don't know. But it's certainly not the Christian Democrats, and it's certainly not the Social Democrats.
You look like you want to add something to that.
No, I was just about to say, like, Alternative für Deutschland, but I think that's, I think...
I'm not sure what they stand for, to be honest.
True.
I'm not sure they know what they stand for. But they will presumably find their feet.
Maybe it's not just betraying that the CDU is betraying its ideals, but maybe it's also moving forward. Mm-hmm. Because I do think that recognizing same-sex marriage is a step forward also for the CDU, and it's certainly not as if they lost votes over agreeing to passing that law.
Should I come back to that? Well, I mean, it depends on how you measure what you were referring to in your original question, which is voter abstention. I think it is alienating people who effectively are looking for a conservative party. That is very clearly not a position that is at all reconcilable with a conservative position. So the point I'm making is, it is a party that is effectively arbitrarily reinventing what it stands for on a daily basis. It doesn't have any kind of mooring intellectually or ideologically anymore. And that is the problem with Merkel's CDU. It's not a center-right party anymore. It is a Merkel party. It is there for the purpose of keeping her in power. It stands for nothing.
First, I guess it's rather successful. And this means we get the approval of around about 40% of the population, which leaves my party as the only single, let's say, Volkspartei, People's Party in Germany.
But again, I mean, we're talking about voter turnout. It's 40% of the people who can be bothered to vote, so it's not really the majority.
No,
and it's successful in terms of securing Angela Merkel, but it's not
no, it's
successful
not
in
only
anything
Angela
else.
Merkel, but securing in a democracy you need the approval of a majority of the people to perform policy. And if it comes to family values, to take your point, for instance, for some conservatives, they think the women should stay at home. And we have also this kind of discussion, are we betraying those people who think women should stay at home because we are providing kindergarten, kinderkrippe for taking care of little children? If one woman would combine what they have trained for, being in a job and being good mothers. And hopefully the fathers do also care for their children, take care for their children. Some feel betrayed. Should we be as conservative only not to lose their votes? I don't think so. And with regard to gay marriage, it is not because of thinking this is a model for everybody, but because we do think that the state should not interfere in private sexual orientation first, and second, because we do think if two people of the same sex take care of themselves and promise themselves to help if the other side gets ill or things like that, and this means there are obligations for a gay marriage. Why not helping via state that this happens? I think this is, according to our values, the right thing to do.
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to be drawn into a debate on policy detail, but I have to say that the two things simply cannot be compared. Of course, German society as a whole has been modernized, and we're no longer in the 1950s. The point is, effectively, a conservative party needs to stand for conservative values, and the Democratic Party doesn't.
Yeah, we have to stand for conservative values, but not for conservative structures. And this is a difference. You have to. No. If you want to preserve your values, you have to change your policy because the world is changing, and you can only preserve your values if you are changing politics as well.
I don't, Jack, want to put you on the spot, but as a longtime observer of German politics and the German party system, do you want to add anything to this so that you have a chance to participate as well?
Well, I mean, I think it's basically an interesting comparison. The word Verdrossenheit was used there before, which I think is quite an interesting term because it does express, I think, the dissatisfaction among voters, not only in Germany, certainly not only in Europe, but also here in the United States. And I think that the problem is, how do you get across to people that there is something that is worth engaging for? And I think that as Ruprecht said, I mean, our turnout at the elections is appalling. What we're going to see on November 4th here at the congressional elections is probably going to be another embarrassing figure. But then you have to ask the question, well, why is it that people don't get engaged? And why do they go either stay at home or turn out for a party that really is more a protest than an actual operating, functional political party in the system? I think this is a dynamic that's going on all over the place. And in some ways, it's a challenge for the political leadership to answer it. And, you can't always blame everything on the voters, but it seems to me that what we've got here is a situation.
We lost it.
They may do that in Catalonia. Over here we have the Tea Party. Huh?
Unfortunately, we're losing you, Jack.
I'm glad we don't have a Tea Party in Germany. And
I
must admit, this kind of conservatism I would fight against.
So I want to thank everybody for this very lively conversation and discussion. Jack, I'm sorry that we lost you towards the end there a little bit. Georg and Ruprecht, thank you for being here in Pittsburgh and having this conversation. And Ron and Allison, thank you for the opportunity. I think there's obviously a lot more to talk about, but this has been a great start. So thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.